Welcome back to Viewpoint. I'm Jim Zogby. My next guest is Ellen Laipson. She's president and CEO of the Henry L. Stimson Center and director of their Southwest Asia project, former vice chair of the National Intelligence Council, former director for Near East and South Asian Affairs of the National Security Council, currently serves on President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Board. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Jim. Glad to be here.
I want to focus on Syria for a minute, and then I do want to continue the conversation I was having with Trita about Iran. But the Arab League came forward with a proposal to Syria. The government stated that it accepted it, but the killing continued. What do you make of the situation? Was there a serious intent on the part of the Syrian government, do we think? And what are the options at this point?
I think in the conversation between the very brittle Syrian regime and the Arab League, there was probably a kind of level of abstraction of, oh, in a few years you'll demonstrate that you've done these reforms, and it was a kind of face-saving gesture in a way for Assad, but there was almost no immediate follow-up action on the Syrians' part. Maybe they believe that they are still going to eventually implement, more or less the Arab League plan. But in a world where things move so quickly and where the Arab League doesn't have as much leverage or influence as I think it would wish to have, I'm not sure it mattered all that much. And so the Syrians are very much locked into their own survival struggle. They're feeling reasonably good that they still control the narrative and that the protesters have not really achieved any structural change in how Syria is governed. So we're in a strange moment where I think they nodded and accepted the Arab League plan without much obligation to follow through.
And the Arab League is meeting this weekend. What do we expect to come out of that?
Well, let's see if the Arab League in this very changing environment has the capacity to kind of re-energize itself and become, I think the Arab League must be surreal inside their conversations, because you have regimes that are at such different places than they were a year or two ago. That they had been settled in with Gaddafi and Mubarak, the ritual behavior of how these different heads of states behaved. Think how much has changed, and that the League itself doesn't quite know what it represents anymore. What is the core essence of Arab unity or Arab cooperation that it represents? I think it's a moment of considerable stress on the organization.
I've been asking different folks about this, and I want to get your take on it. The situation in Syria, to me, seems, I don't see an outcome. I see a regime that doesn't see that it's going to change its course anytime soon. Reforms maybe, but they've been saying reforms maybe since they took over. An opposition that doesn't appear ready for prime time. The outside folks don't agree with the inside folks. In fact, just actually admonished the inside folks for agreeing to a dialogue with the regime, and a regime, as you said, that seems still in control of a significant part of the country, but now the opposition getting armed, and I see no good coming of this. I worry that the 3,500, 4,000, how many have been killed, could increase by multiples of 10 or more if this spins out of control, and I see every indication that it may. And the U.S. having, and the Arab League and others in the region having far less leverage than they would like to have to sort of keep the lid on and control it. No one wants negotiations, and don't seem on the horizon. It's a sorry state of affairs. Is that right, or am I missing something here where an outcome is possible?
Well, I think it's certainly a sorry state of affairs, and there is, as you say, perhaps a looming tragedy. I mean, what really had been a very spontaneous and peaceful uprising by a significant portion of parts of Syria's rural and semi-urban population turns into a civil war. And the danger that these protesters have been given so little in return and don't feel that the state is interested in compromising. So their demands have hardened. And let's worry about their access to guns. I mean, if this breaks into each city has its own militia group or something, we are talking about a protracted struggle. In those circumstances, I think we would want to watch the Syrian military and see if it cracks, because what Assad has benefited from up until now is that sort of an Alawite-led officer corps and military has actually suffered relatively few defections. I hear estimates in the sort of from 5,000, high estimates, or 10,000 of how many Syrian soldiers may actually have defected. I think in a scenario that looks more like civil war, we'll see much more stress on the rank-and-file soldiers, and that might lead to the systemic change.
There are demands now for a buffer zone to be created to provide protection for civilians, but the unintended consequences of that seem to me to be quite grave. Who would do it? How would it be done? And what military action would have to take place in order to do it? And who would do it? I mean, would it be the Turks? Would it be, I mean, NATO was involved in Libya. I'm not quite sure we see NATO involved here.
Well, we've seen the UN.
Who else could play a role?
Well, the UN and the Department of Peacekeeping Operations have considerable experience in creating these humanitarian zones or safe zones for civilians in civil wars, in many cases where the state is so weak that the UN peacekeepers were able to go in a non-permissive environment. I think the Syrian state is still a very coercive apparatus and would probably resist the international community trying to impose a decision on them. So it's tricky to imagine how we might see it happening. Now, the Turks did do this for the Iraqi Kurds, remember, that they did the right thing. They built tent cities along the border. They allowed refugees to come in, and then the Turks, as I recall, allowed the international community to provide extra support, and it was temporary, and the people went home again after the crisis was over. So that is certainly something we should think about, but think of poor Lebanon. Think of the repercussions of chaos or civil war in Syria for Lebanon. It's hard to imagine. You can imagine various communities in Lebanon thinking they should be part of the struggle, or do they hunker down and try to make sure that it doesn't affect them too much? But it can't be good news for Lebanon right now either.
In terms of the U.S., what options are there, and or are there none? There are suggestions that the U.S. may be playing a role through Turkey or helping procure arms. I hear lots of rumors to this effect. Is there, to the best of your knowledge, a U.S. role in one being played, or is there one that you could project?
Yeah, well, I think we have a reasonably clear political position, which is that Assad has lost his legitimacy and that change in Syria is inevitable. But I don't think we know how to operationalize that. I don't think we've made very tactical decisions about how close should we get to which Syrian opposition. I think the figure of our ambassador, this courageous diplomat who's been reaching out to the opposition and, as I understand, will return to Syria soon, he has made himself a more interesting and influential player with the opposition, but that may not be sufficient. I have not heard, and I don't believe, that we're interested yet in having any military involvement here. And I can well imagine that we coordinate with the Turks, but it's good if the regional actors are able to do some of the maneuvering right now. But I do think the United States and the Europeans are a bit wringing their hands. I don't think there's a clear strategy for how to bring about regime change in a place like Syria.
Let me get you into the conversation out there. If you want to give us a call, the numbers are up on the screen. If you're calling from overseas, the number is 001-202-420-5665. If you're calling from here in the U.S., it's 1-202-420-5730. I want to continue the conversation with that I had with Trita about the U.S. options vis-a-vis Iran. The report came out, IAEA. The pre-report hype was significant. The report itself was interesting. There was some interesting new information there. But the administration seems to suggest there's no direct evidence here of anything, and yet the pressure is mounting for the U.S. to do something. Talk a little about what the U.S. can do in the wake of this report, and what should it do?
Well, I think we need to be careful of whether the release of the report was being used in a kind of instrumental way by the people who, independent of what the report actually says, just want to beat the drum for tougher measures towards Iran. So let's be careful to not implicate the IAEA's very technical professional work with the debate over war or peace vis-a-vis Iran. So I think the Obama administration kept its cool and said, you know, we know what the facts are, we know what the reality is, and we still want to let diplomacy play its course. I believe that we're going to go back to the table in the P5+1 format with the Iranians. No guarantees that the Iranians have any new concessions to offer. You know, best case scenario would be that this report rattled them enough that they would like to actually be forthcoming.
So those conversations are going to continue? My
understanding is that most of the parties, you know, Mrs. Ashton, the EU's foreign minister, has you know, proposed, I believe, a date that could be within the next month or so, and they'll go back to the table. Now, whether that's a sterile exercise, but at least suggests that that diplomatic mechanism has not run its course. It is not over yet. It still has some life left in it. I think the U.S. side should be doing some much heavier planning and thinking about that 20% option that the Iranians have offered and is a variation of the Turkey-Brazil deal of a year ago. I would like us to be as creative and imaginative as we can in getting the Iranians' attention that there is still a peaceful outcome here, but it will involve them following through with, I think, is an offer. You know, they keep enrichment capability, but they accept that the processed fuel for their reactor would be provided by international sources, not their own.
And we're getting reports of Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, formerly head of intelligence, saying just now that a strike on Iran would have unintended consequences.
Good.
And you concur?
I think it would be devastating for the region. Yeah.
And for the U.S., what would the impact be? Well,
if the United States is the one conducting the raid, I think there are certainly consequences for us in the region. But whoever were to conduct the raid, there will be, it will have ripple effects of insecurity in the region that will be very hard to absorb.
The problem is that in an election year, and you've been through the White Houses during election years before, the ability to pursue a path that may be the right path is circumscribed by what is political.
I'm reasonably confident that a president who has been trying to scale down two wars because he thinks that they, at least in part, contributed to the financial stresses that our country is going to be in for a good number of years, would not be sort of lighthearted about engaging in any major military enterprise in the Middle East. Well, I think he has the discipline to avoid that scenario.
We've been losing some calls, but I've just got one back from California. California, your call.
Hi. Hello, my name is Lane. I'm calling from Los Angeles.
Sure. Your question.
The whole Iranian deal, you know, it's kind of like a push-up little scenario because you got all these nations condemning someone for getting the technology, even though they've proven that they are using it for humanitarian and power aids. But for them to be blamed for getting a nuclear weapon, this is a world of defense. If you're going to be cornered and threatened with the fact that they have a weapon that will dismantle you, like the Russians, they had a nuclear bomb, we had a nuclear bomb. We never went down to the showdown because both knew that would be a complete outcome of the same and be destruction. So to blame them is wrong because since the
caller, we lost him. I get his point, but the issue is that the path we want to pursue? You know, mutually assured destruction, which is the path we had with the Soviets.
The U.S. and the Soviets were peers, and we developed this whole crazy mathematical formula about deterrence, etc. That doesn't pertain in the case of Iran, so there's much more uncertainty about what a nuclear Iran would look like. But I don't accept his premise that the Iranians' nuclear activities are just humanitarian. He seemed to be suggesting both that they are, you know, deserving of a weapon, but they're not doing. I think the Iranians, I'm willing to accept the premise that the Iranians themselves have not yet committed to going all the way to full weaponization. They do care a lot about proving that they can master the enrichment, the fuel cycle, and that they have an advanced nuclear technological capability. But I think that's still different and short of saying that they've made a commitment to have a full weapons program.
Let's go to Michigan for a call. Caller?
Yes, thank you for having me on. I'd like to make a statement about
make it quick.
The nuclear arms race here. It's the cat is out of the bag, and this business of trying to prevent countries from having them. It's like when gunpowder was invented. Look where it's at now. I mean, we're spending trillions of dollars in trying to prevent people from having nuclear arms. grant you it's wrong to have nuclear weapons, but as far as nuclear power goes, you're not going to be able to stop it, and we're spending a considerable amount of time and money and anxiety level over and calling different countries' names back and forth. But you know,
Colin, let me stop you. Let me stop you and ask you a question. I can agree with you on the rhetoric that's used, but this sounds to me a lot like the argument that if everybody on the plane had a gun, the plane wouldn't get hijacked, or that if every kid at Virginia Tech had a gun, the shooter wouldn't have gotten anywhere. I'm not sure it makes the world less dangerous. I'm almost sure it makes it more dangerous if there aren't efforts to control the use of this technology in the way that the world is now. I'm agreeing with you on the name calling, but I'm not sure I agree with you on the fact that we just ought to let things, you know, run free. You got any response there? I lost them. Your comment.
Well, I still believe that we should all aspire to a world without nuclear weapons. I think that is still an idealistic goal that at least some of the major countries of the world aspire to, and I certainly think the Middle East would be better off if they were less focused on proving their manhood by getting nuclear weapons, and that applies to everybody, Pakistan, Israel, Iran, I think, and we can hope that there's actually the beginning of an international conversation about a Middle East without weapons of mass destruction. So I don't accept the premise that this is just the universality of nukes is a kind of inevitable force of nature. In fact, people frequently point out that John F. Kennedy had feared a world with 25 nuclear states happening in his lifetime, and lo and behold, 50 years later, there's still only 10 or 11, depending on how you count, nuclear-capable states.
Thank you for joining me, Ellen.
Thank you, Jim.
Up next, I'll look at the GOP presidential debate with Alex Rorty of the National Journal. It was an interesting debate, so don't go away.